Certain and Uncertain, Chapter 23, Instruction. Cooper smiled nervously out at the classroom. He'd been at the Plumber Academy for barely a week, and was already being asked to show his inventions to several of the classes. This particular invention was relatively new, and he couldn't claim all the credit for it. He'd just finished sharing how he'd put the gun together, and was now showing them the video he'd taken of Jen testing the weapon. A whisper had rippled through the classroom at the sight of her. The whole Max Force had learned quickly that Jen was something of a hot topic around the academy. Many a cadet had originally joined because of Jen's initial defeat of Vilgax. Manny was a little peeved to learn that a large portion of their tactics course included being able to adapt on the fly, and often used Jen as an example. Cooper watched the recording, smiling to himself at the appreciative gasps as the DNA skin sloughed off, revealing an unharmed human. "But I have enough for 7, if we're lucky." Jen on the recording nodded to Cooper. "Between all of us, that'll have to be enough." "We have 7 people against an army?" The recording cut off here, with Jen reaching over and shutting off the recorder. Cooper flicked a finger at the screen, which went completely dark. The room was silent as the lights came back up. "Any questions?" he asked, hoping there weren't any. He wasn't so good at talking to groups of people, although the academic setting did help. A few appendages shot up. Cooper pointed at the werewolf-like alien. "Did she really head an assault against the Highbreed with only 7 people?" Murmurs echoed around the room, and the professor cleared their throat. "Keep it relevant to the course, please. This is advanced mechanics, not tactics." They did look curious, though, multifaceted gold eyes glancing at the hollow box in Cooper's hand as though hoping he had recorded the battle. "It's fine with me, Professor." The Necrophrygian sighed and nodded. "Very well." "There were 8 of us present at the initial assault on the Highbreed base in La Soledad, but I only had enough time to complete 7 guns in time for the fight." Murmurs swept through the room again. Cooper continued. "We did get some backup later on when Magister Tennyson showed up with his team of 4 people." Cooper admitted that last part nearly silently, but the admission echoed around the room. Another hand shot into the air. This one belonged to a bug-like alien who bore a distinct resemblance to a giant bipedal cricket. Cooper nodded, pointing at them. "Yeah?" "You guys fought the Highbreed with 11 people?" They sounded incredulous. Cooper shrugged. "Technically 10. One of the people we had was less than trustworthy. He ran off not too far into the fight, and technically only Kevin, Gwen, and Jen fought the Highbreed themselves. The rest of us were using these guns to take out the alien army." Another impressed murmur passed through the room. A third hand lifted, and Cooper nodded to the alien. This one he recognized as Rook Blanco, the upperclassman who'd shown the rest of the Max Force around on their first day at the academy. "I do not understand. Why did no one attempt to contact the plumbers for additional assistance?" Cooper ran his hands through his hair. "We did. Jen was sending the previous Magister in our sector regular updates. He never got back to her. He deputized your team and left. He was..." Cooper floundered. A new voice echoed around the room. "I believe Jennifer's words describing him were, to quote verbatim, a fucking bureaucrat, more interested in procedure than actually saving anyone." "She's not wrong." A small figure appeared on the professor's desk. The class gasped. The professor scrambled to clear the papers out of the way of Azimuth, the first thinker. The Galvan did not spare him a glance, though. "You must be Cooper Daniels. I wanted to speak to you about these guns of yours." That was all the warning they got before Azimuth tapped a device he was carrying, and he, Cooper, and the information Cooper had brought to the presentation with him vanished in a teleporter beam. The professor rolled multifaceted eyes and let out a breath, frosting the papers in their hands. "The first thinker of the Galvans, everyone." Class dismissed. Chapter 24. Father Figures. Campouts with the Tennysons now included Pierce, Ethan, and Kevin as well. And as most of them ate more food than was normal for teens their age, they also included 2 grills. One for Grandpa Max and his culinary concoctions. The other was for Pierce, who was a fantastic chef, something the others were all grateful for when they discovered that Max was making squid burgers. But All of them grew worried when Max cried out and fell, taking his grill down with him. "Grandpa!" Jen vaulted over the picnic table, and she and Gwen were at his side in an instant, shooting each other worried looks. No one ever brought it up, but he was nearing 66, and he wasn't exactly a spring chicken anymore. Pierce abandoned his grill and helped the girls guide Max into a chair, but after a moment, he was fine. But he had no memory of overturning his grill, nor the loss of his squid burgers. Both girls insisted he take it easy as they cleared up the mess, and Pierce fried up a few more burgers. Ethan filled a glass with water and went to hand it to Max, but he was muttering something, eyes vacant. "Jen?" Ethan called out, and the brunette stepped over to them just as Max jerked slightly and went back to normal again. "What? What are you all staring at? Do I have something on my face?" Jen's frown deepened as she looked over her grandfather. It happened again. "We should get someone to take a look at you." He shook his head. "I'm fine. Never felt better." He faltered at the look in every eye. "I probably just need some sleep. If I still feel a little loopy in the morning, we'll go see someone, okay?" Both girls agreed a bit reluctantly, wishing that he would go now, but all of them were aware of the stubbornness that was Max Tennyson. So they ate their burgers in silence and set up their tents. Max was sleeping in the rust bucket while the others took the 2 tents. They'd been on lookout for further tremors, but nothing had happened after the initial earthquake. The girls disappeared into their tent quickly, and Pierce frowned as he sat out on the dirt, looking up at the stars. Ethan frowned, but he didn't say anything. He wasn't sure he liked Pierce. He'd seen the way the spiked teen looked at Jen, and it made him nervous. Ethan knew he wasn't as good at the weird alien stuff as Pierce, and without the gun, he wasn't too much help in their regular fights. Pierce had a natural talent he didn't. He sighed and stepped into the tent. The boys were sharing. Kevin sighed and sat down next to Pierce. He stayed quiet, though. Eventually, the other boy spoke. "Do you think Max is going to be okay?" Kevin nodded. "He's the toughest guy I've ever met." It wasn't a yes or a no, but it was what Pierce needed. He nodded, still looking up. "I never knew my dad." The admission was quiet. Kevin nodded. "I don't really remember my old man." He picked at a steel fingernail with a stone one. "He was the plumber, one of Max's old partners. Mom used to tell me stories about him, but he wasn't really around much when I was a kid. Off saving the world. Then he died. Sometimes I think I remember how he laughed, but I'm not sure if it was even him." Pierce nodded. "Yeah." They were quiet for another moment. "Helen and I have the same mom, different dads." Kevin shrugged. "I thought that might be the case." "I sort of remember her dad, but he wasn't around for long. It's funny. Whenever I try to picture my dad, all I can think of is Max." Kevin grinned. "I don't think he minds." Pierce grinned, clearly placated. He stood and stretched. "We should hit the sack, huh?" Kevin nodded. Waking up the next morning, the teens found the rust bucket gone, then tracking Max to a weird orb where he was trapped with several other people. Well, it wasn't the way they wanted to wake up. The orb quickly grew into an 80-story monster Highbreed made from foliage. Jen pulled herself to her feet from where she'd been thrown as Humongosaur. "Nothing we do is stopping that thing." Gwen called out. Jen's eyes narrowed. "We might not be able to stop it, but I think I know someone who can. Keep it busy. Slow it down as much as you can. I'll be back." She went jet ray and took off at full speed. "You know, letting us in on the plan couldn't hurt," Ethan called out after her, aiming the cannon he'd retrieved from the rust bucket at the knees of the thing. There was no time, though. Jen landed at Julie's and whistled. Ship leapt into her arms, and Julie stuck her head out the back door. "Jen, thought you were—" "No time to explain. Need Ship back soon." With that, she took off again, sending Julie's hair flying around her face. "Camping," Julie finished before blowing a strand of hair out of her face and closing her door again. Jen flew with Ship to her house. She opened the windows and seized the green backpack she'd brought home from her trip with Paradox and Azimuth. She pulled it open, tossing aside the outfit on top. Metal clattered as it hit the floor, and she let out a triumphant sound as she grabbed a wrist-mounted device. She strapped it on next to the Omnitrix and pulled up the coordinates for the Highbreed homeworld. She whistled, and Ship leapt onto her shoulders. She tapped the device the way Azimuth had shown her. White lights flashed, and she and Ship vanished. Ryan Rossick III was having a lovely day. He'd received some fantastic news just that morning, and affairs of the day were flying by. Then a white light of a teleporter beam formed in the center of the audience room. "Were we expecting further delegates today?" His assistant shook her head. "Not for several more hours, Highbreed Supreme." The room tensed, but relaxed as the light formed into a familiar figure in a green jacket. "Jennifer Tennyson, it is lovely to see you, though we had not expected this honor." He bowed, and every Highbreed in the room followed suit. She smiled a little awkwardly. "Rainy, it's good to see you too, but this isn't a social visit. I need your help." Chapter 25. Some news. Rainy could not risk attempting to stop the failsafe himself. He was the leader of his people. He had to stand back and watch as this played out, even as the failsafe collapsed around the heroes. Jennifer Tennyson, he cried out, "is fine, as is everyone else, thanks," Kevin called out as a pink bubble emerged from the wreckage. "Not everyone," Jen frowned. "The other Highbreed followed orders, Jennifer Tennyson. There is no greater honor for a Highbreed soldier." Jen frowned. Rainy knelt so they were at the same level. "I swear to you, Jennifer Tennyson, I will put this right. I will scour the records and ensure that no others will have to go through this." Jen nodded. "Thanks. Come on, Ship and I will take you home." He nodded and stood, bowing. "I am pleased I could be of assistance, Jennifer Tennyson." "Hang on a minute," a voice came from the sergeant who'd been leading the small battalion to the defense of the nuclear plant. Jen stepped in front of Rainy. "Who are you people? What is that thing?" Before Max could answer, Jen spoke. "Talk to Lieutenant Steele. Blonde guy, scar through his eye. He has my number." She nodded, and Ship turned back into his battleship mode, and the plumbers loaded on with Rainy, leaving the confused military behind to deal with 8 confused civilians and the remains of a giant plant monster. Jen dropped the others off at Kevin's car and the rust bucket respectively and set back out into space with Rainy. They set a much more reasonable pace this time, and it would take them a few hours to reach the Highbreed homeworld. They remained in companionable silence for a while until they entered the Highbreed system. "I have recently chosen a mate," Rainy stated. Jen grinned. "Aw, Rainy, that's great." He nodded. "We are expecting a young one." Jen turned to him and grinned wide. "That's fantastic." She leapt from her seat and wrapped her arms around, as far around him as they would go. He blinked. "What are you doing?" She looked up at him and her face went bright red. "Sorry. Guess it's a very human thing." She let him go. "It's called a hug. You do it with friends and when you're happy or excited. It's a way humans show affection." Rainy nodded and wrapped an arm around her as well. She grinned again. "I would ask you to be protector in extremis of my offspring." Jen frowned as he released the hug. "Not sure what that means. I don't think we have that on Earth." Rainy nodded. "I see. It is an honor on my world. If something were to happen to me and my mate, my child would go to you to be raised and protected." Jen nodded. "Oh, like a godparent. I would be honored." He nodded as they came in for a landing. When Jen got home, Lieutenant Steele was waiting in her living room having tea with her mother, who looked a little nervous. He looked very out of place in his combat gear next to her mother's fine china. Jen grinned. "I see you got my message." He shook his head. "I did. Do you know how hard it was explaining to my superiors why the shape-shifting superhero knows my name?" Jen laughed. "I imagine pretty difficult." He shook his head. "Until they got a call from your grandfather. He knows my boss, so they wrote it off. Mind explaining what happened today?" She sat down in the love seat. "You could have just called. You have my number." He rolled his eyes. "No, I don't. I have your grandfather's number. Your cousin insisted he's on medical leave for at least 24 hours and wouldn't give me anything." Jen snorted into the cookie she'd snagged off the table as her mother covered her own laugh. gonna go get the brownies out of the oven. Jen grinned as her mother left the room. You should come by more often. She doesn't bust out sweets for anyone. He shook his head, taking a sip of his tea. She wasn't so keen when I first showed up. Seemed to think I was here to arrest you and nearly took my head off with a broom. Jen laughed. She calmed down when I told her I was just here for a debrief. But that was 2 hours ago. Where were you? Space. She bit into her second cookie, and he looked her over with a raised eyebrow. It's fine. What happened today started because of a misunderstanding. A soldier who didn't know the war was over setting off a failsafe. Steele nodded, then frowned, setting down his cup gently. What war? The one I prevented. He blinked. I don't remember this. Jen nodded. I know. That's because I do my job. And I do it better under wraps, as it were. So, if we can keep the top dogs out of my business, I'll keep the alien threats under control. You guys do your thing. Steele nodded. Like you took care of that Vilgax character. He watched as her whole expression darkened. The cookie in her hand snapped in half. Yeah, he shouldn't be back. Steele raised an eyebrow. You... She looked at him and shook her head. No. He lost the Conqueror's challenge. According to galactic law, he's banished from the planet. Steele sighed. And I don't suppose you have a copy of galactic law laying around for me to look over. Jen grinned. Wait here. She bounded up the stairs to her room as her mother came back into the room with a plate of fresh brownies. Sandra frowned. Is everything all right? Steele shrugged, but before he could answer, a crash sounded from Jen's room. Fuck! Steele was on his feet and up the stairs before the plate of brownies could hit the floor. He pulled his sidearm and kicked in her door. She was on the ground, partially buried under an avalanche of metals. She was working her way free. He reached out a hand. What is all this? Metals from grateful species who were happy I prevented a war. Sandra shook her head. I told you not to leave them piled up in your closet. Jen nodded, rubbing bruised legs as she picked her way through the mess back to her closet. So you were serious. Why would other species be grateful you prevented a war on Earth? Never said it was just an Earth war. Didn't want to spook ya. It was a universal threat. Not anymore, though. They're cool now. Aha! Before he could ask who they were, she pulled a gargantuan book from the inside of the closet. My copy of Galactic Law, courtesy of Ultimos years ago. I now bequeath it to you. I've never actually finished reading it. That's a lot of law. She nodded. Yeah, I skimmed it over the past few years. She turned to her mother. I heard a crash. Did any of the brownies make it? Sandra laughed. I didn't put them all on the plate, so yes. Jen cheered and headed back down the stairs. Her mother shook her head, following. You will have to clean your room, young lady. Jen nodded. Steele shook his head. This is going to be a long day.